Hello, this is Court Watch with Alex Swoyer, and I'm excited to bring you the latest episode of my podcast, where I am joined by Abhishek Kambli, partner at Holtzman Vogel and a civil litigation expert who worked in the Trump administration's Justice Department, handling high-priority matters. Abby is joining me in a moment to break down the High Court's biggest rulings of the 2025-2026 term and tell us whether the justices favored the Trump administration overall or not. On the immigration front, President Trump did score a win with the justices when they ruled that his administration can end what's called temporary protective status for Haitians and Syrians who are currently in the U.S. They had challenged their removal, basically saying they weren't given a due process right, but the justices said they weren't able to challenge this. This was not for the court to decide. It was an executive branch issue, which was a major win for the president. However, he had a major loss on immigration. The justices struck down basically his executive order ending birthright citizenship. And in their ruling, they said the 14th Amendment essentially guarantees U.S. citizenship to anyone who is born on U.S. soil. This term also saw a pair of cases where he had a win and a loss on his ability to fire people. President Trump had tried to fire a member of the Federal Trade Commission, Rebecca Slaughter. She challenged that and said that she was not able to be removed. However, the court said that the president did have authority to remove some of these officials within executive branch agencies. They separated this from a separate case that was involving the Federal Reserve. Lisa Cook was fired by the president, and she challenged her removal. The justices said the Federal Reserve is different because they basically tied it to the monies of the U.S., basically tracing back all the way to Alexander Hamilton in the talk that essentially the Treasury, financial, the Federal Reserve, banks, for example, should be nonpartisan and not have any sort of political, I guess you could say, lean one way or the other. So there was a kind of split in terms of immigration and firings in terms of whether the president won those major decisions. He also had his tariff fight earlier this year before the court, where he had a loss in February. The administration has been able to implement these tariffs in a different way, but of course, that was a major decision when it came down against the Trump administration. There was also some major election-related victories and decisions handed down this term. One decision rewrote the underpinnings, basically, of the Voting Rights Act. It made sure that there's more of a colorblind approach for when states draw their congressional district maps. That case, it's Calais versus Louisiana, was ignited basically in a round of redistricting that's going on now in Republican-led southern states, and Democrats are vowing to try to retribute and redraw their own lines in blue states. The court essentially ruled there that so long as a state redistricts their map with partisan intent and not based on race, the map can be upheld. There was another case that involved mail-in ballots in a dispute out of Mississippi. The court ruled against the Republican National Committee here, which was important. They challenged Mississippi's law that allowed for mail-in ballots to be counted up to 5 days past Election Day. The RNC had argued, no, there's only one federal election day, ballots should be counted then, something the president has really pushed for, but the court did not go to that argument. They sided with Mississippi and upheld that law. This allows states to go ahead and set their own counting measures. I think Washington State's 21 days, Illinois is 14 days, so that was a loss considerably for those Republicans who are looking to try to rein in mail-in ballots. I want to get to one of the major cases of the term that people were questioning about was transgender athletes and their ability to compete in girls' sports. Idaho and West Virginia had passed laws that said only biological girls can compete in girls' sports. Those were challenged by transgender athletes, basically saying they were discriminatory under the Equal Protection Clause of the Constitution, and they won in lower courts. So the girls and the states appealed to the justices and said, no, please overturn this lower court decision, and they did. The justices basically said that states can pass these types of laws that ensure biological girls compete in girls' sports, which was seen really as a major loss for the LGBTQ community. On the issue of guns, the court did side with Second Amendment advocates in a case out of Hawaii. Their law there had said that those who have a permitted lawful carry concealed weapons license must actually also get explicit permission to carry on private property, even if the property is generally open to the public. So think about restaurants, for example. The majority of the court ruled that law runs afoul of your gun rights, your constitutional rights. Now I want to bring in Abby to break all this down for us. Thanks, Abby, for taking time to answer some of my questions. I really appreciate it. Some clarity here on what this term means. First, I want to ask you, What do you think was the most important ruling that the justices handed down this term? And why was it so consequential?
Yeah, so I think the biggest case that at least involved the Trump administration would be the Slaughter case. Uh, Anyone who's been involved in the conservative legal movement knows that for almost 100 years, that's been something that conservatives have been trying to get overturned. And
Hmm.
even though the result was widely expected, it is very meaningful for what it means for executive power and the fact that the presidency ultimately belongs to the president and that even Congress can't interfere with the president's core removal authorities in order for him to do his job. And I think it will have a lot of meaning for whenever someone runs for president. You can have greater assurance that they'll be able to carry out the agenda that they promised voters. So even though there were some other cases that got a lot of attention, and this one, kind of fell to the backdrop because of how expected it was, people shouldn't lose track of how important this case was.
Yeah. So on that one, I know that that was like a pair of people kind of put the Rebecca Slaughter case, Federal Trade Commission. Correct me if I'm wrong. President Trump fired her. That was challenged, basically saying, that I guess it's an executive branch agency. He doesn't have authority over that firing, but the court said yes. I guess it gives the president more, power to control those leading various agencies within the executive branch. My question though is this was always talked about in combination with Lisa Cook with the Federal Reserve and his attempt to remove her. And that was also before the court this term. And they went the other way there. They sided with Lisa Cook. I think they basically said, correct me if I'm wrong, but that she deserved more of like you can refer to it maybe as like a procedural due process right to challenge a firing. Is that how that came down?
Yeah, so they put the Fed. So backing up, the Solicitor General and DOJ generally did not argue the same constitutional arguments in Cook that they did with Slaughter. Instead, they argued that they had cause to remove her. And the Supreme Court concluded that there is some type of due process that's required beyond just the.
I think it was a Truth Social post. Was that how he fired her, if
Yeah, I
I
don't know the
remember right?
details of exactly how it went down, but I mean, when the president is the one that's terminating you, that brings up some questions of what exactly does due process look like? Does that mean you get a meeting with the president and get to pitch your case and given all the multitude of other things that the president has to do that voters want him to do? But the other thing that they also concluded, even though the DOJ didn't argue it, they reached the constitutional question of whether the statute is constitutional or not, which normally they don't do if that's not an argument in front of them. But I guess they felt the need to assure the markets that of something. They basically decided that the Fed is just in a different category, and they used the first and second banks of the United States, which, interestingly enough, was is not the best example because both Thomas Jefferson and Andrew Jackson uh, eliminated those banks in part because of constitutional concerns. So that was kind of the history and tradition that they relied on for the Fed being different. And of course, the Fed has a lot more power than those two banks did. So that was how they reached the result. But that ruling is basically limited to the Fed. And I don't see too many other agencies that it would apply to. So even though that didn't go the Trump administration's way, that doesn't necessarily mean it's going to be, yeah, it's going to have much effect beyond the Fed.
And one quick question, like, it sounds like they could even continue this, like, she could, challenge her firing and lower courts will consider it. Could it work its way back to the justices eventually?
Theoretically, it could.
Her
I don't know
actual
what that would look
dismissal.
like in practice. Yeah, and this was on
Okay.
a
That was
preliminary
one of my
injunction
questions.
posture, but yeah,
Okay.
but I mean, it answered the merits in many ways, so I don't see that coming back, at least not in its
Okay.
current
The
form.
other thing I wanted the other case, I mean, this is probably the case that I get asked the most about is birthright citizenship. And so my question for you is, a lot of people are saying, "Oh, well, could Congress have done something here to address it to help basically bolster President Trump's executive order?" My question, I suppose, is it sounds like the opinion by Chief Justice Roberts was pretty broad, like upholding the 14th Amendment as guaranteeing birthright citizenship to anyone really born on US soil. So, I don't really see a way that Congress could step in here to correct this. Tell me if I'm wrong. Like, what's next?
Yeah, so it was 6-3, on the merits of the question of whether the executive order was lawful, but 5-4 on the constitutional question. So Justice Kavanaugh didn't think that the Constitution prohibited it, but concluded that it was inconsistent with the statute. So what happened there is that, there's still 5 votes that says even Congress can't fix it. So it would take one of a switch in one of those Supreme Court justices to ever get to the point where Congress can pass a statute. But if that were to happen, then Justice Kavanaugh's opinion leaves or concurrence leaves open an avenue for Congress to fix the issue.
Yeah. It's so interesting. Some conservatives in DC have talked about, well, this is like the new Roe v. Wade. We're going to work to overturn this. Of course, you're going to have to wait decades for maybe a new court.
Well, not
That would be
necessarily.
my
Like, I
stance.
mean, yeah, one I posted about this on my X account, but if one justice, ends up being replaced in the majority, especially if Republicans maintain power, then you can have a situation where there is a statutory way to do it. And the big thing is, there was a lot of talk about how the conventional wisdom was that it was so obviously unconstitutional, but when you actually dig into the issue, it's a lot more complicated than that. So the fact that it landed 5-4 on the constitutional issue was something that probably surprised a lot of people because there were a lot of
Mhm.
liberal commentators saying this is so easy, it's going to be a 9-0 case. And there was a district court judge that questioned whether it was sanctionable for DOJ to even defend it. So all of that conventional wisdom is thrown out the window. So I think the case achieved a lot on that.
What about having served in the Trump DOJ? I really want your opinion on this. There was the tariffs case this term, his birthright citizenship order, the firings that you just referenced. There's a lot at stake for the Trump administration, even like the mail in ballot case that was, the RNC was litigating, but of course, Trump had an interest in that. Was this a term that was like a win for the Trump administration or a loss or a wash?
I think that it's a win overall. So, and I'll break that down into 3 parts as succinctly as I can. So, first, the cases that they won on were some pretty major cases. So, Mullen v. Doe on TPS, that is a huge deal. And they've been uniformly winning on the immigration side, which was the president's top priority. Uh, so, the cases like Mullen v. Doe and Slaughter, and you can go on about the victories that they've had, especially when you include the emergency docket as well. 2, the losses are not really that big, like with the learning resources case. Now the Trump administration is using Section 122 for tariffs, so they realize that they can't do something one way. They're always good about trying to find other legal authority to do it.
Avenues.
Yeah,
Right, right.
and then when you include the cases that they didn't litigate but were amicus on, so for instance, on the Hecox and BPJ case, that was a major case. The DOJ was an amicus in support of the
The girl at
yeah,
the
of the
female
petitioners. Yep.
athletes, right.
And then the other case, the Calais case, ultimately, when you look at how the court ruled on Section 2 of the VRA and how that affects redistricting, they accepted the DOJ's position as what the new test should be for when something violates Section 2. So when you put all that together, like that's a very consequential case because a lot of redistricting for decades will change forever on that, and that affects the balance of political power for the foreseeable future.
Perfect. My last thing I always ask is if I didn't ask you something I should have, or if you've seen something out there in the media about this term that you think is inaccurate that want to take a minute to correct.
So I think big picture, one of the ways to a lot of attention, is being given to the Trump administration's executive orders and things saying, well, why didn't you write it in a way that would have completely avoided it being
Right.
an issue in court? But one of the things that should be kept in mind is part of what the thinking was to create court precedent on these issues. So if you stick by something that's watered down, maybe it survives judicial review, but the executive order, an ex-president can overturn it, and if at that point not worth the paper that it was written on. But the precedent that you create, especially the cases that do go to the Supreme Court, because Slaughter, the genesis of that was an executive order. The precedent that comes out of that is something that lasts well beyond this administration. So I think that's important to keep in mind when people are analyzing the Trump administration cases is that there is a bigger picture beyond just what the executive order itself says.
Perfect. Well, I really appreciate you coming on, and I'm going to have you back once we have an idea of what administration cases are going to be before the
Yes.
justices come October. I know there's usually a few days where they start issuing some of these
Mhm.
orders, and we start stacking up this upcoming term. So thank you so much for your time.
Yeah, thank you for having me.
Thanks for tuning in to the latest episode of Court Watch. If you have not subscribed yet to this podcast, please do so, and also feel free to email me interesting questions or topics that you want explored about the legal reporting world. I'll do my best to answer them during each episode. Thanks for listening, and I look forward to hearing from you all soon. Listen to my podcast, Court Watch, at WashingtonTimes.com or wherever you get your favorite podcasts.